Yes, thank you for joining us for today's Climate Justice Working Group meeting. Today is Wednesday, November 17th, 2021. I want to start off by apologizing for our cancellation, short notice cancellation of the November 11th meeting. We did have an internal issue that we have dealt with, and we unfortunately will need to postpone the vote. So if anyone was here to hear the vote, unfortunately that is not happening today. We will discuss rescheduling the vote in this meeting. Just as a reminder, if anybody isn't speaking, just to keep your line on mute. If you could please announce your name before you start talking, just to help us out with the transcript and make it a little bit easier for folks to sort of translate the transcript, that would be great. We do have some interns who are willing to work on that. So we would like to make their job as easy as possible. So I will start just with a quick roll call. I'm just going to go by how it's listed here in my list here. Abby.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi. Amy.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Jonathan.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon.
Let's see you. Elizabeth.
Here. Good afternoon, everyone.
Joe, we have you on.
Yes, hi, this is Joe McNerney with the New York State Department of Labor. Thank you.
Rawa.
Good afternoon. Good to be here with you.
And Sonal.
Good afternoon. I'm here.
And Chris just got on.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, sorry about that. We are also joined today by Jared Snyder from DEC and Lisa Covert in our Office of General Counsel, and Samir Ranade from NYSERDA. Did I miss anybody? Oh, and Sarin Bernard, who works with me in the Office of Environmental Justice. She is our host today, and if there are any issues, please feel free to message her, email her, and she will try to address them very quickly. All right, let us continue moving forward. So today we are going to get into the barriers and opportunities study, just to discuss that quickly today for about 30 minutes. This is a longer meeting. This is going to be 3 hours. We'll see if we need the entire time. We're also going to, have a quick review of some of the legislation, the criteria for the disadvantaged communities criteria, and then we'll also discuss some of the progress from our last meeting and moving forward with the developing the rules for the definition. We'll take a break. And we'll talk about the voting and what we would like to see, what the schedule could potentially be. Does anybody have anything they think they want to add to the agenda, or are we good with what we're seeing? All right, I will take silence as we are all good, and we will move forward. So the barrier study and update, Samir, if you and Amanda would like to talk about that, and I can just move the slides along.
Sure, I will. Good afternoon, everybody. I will kick it to Amanda to get this started.
Oh yes, Amanda and Alex from the Loom. I'm so sorry. I should have introduced you. You are very, very important members of this process, and that was in no way a slight.
Thanks, Luana. This is Amanda Dwelly from Illum Advising, and you can advance the slide here. So we did give ourselves about 20 to 30 minutes to talk about this, and we in no way want to put anyone on the spot. No obligation to share any ideas or feedback in this call. We love ideas in writing, but we did want to provide this opportunity to talk together about it if anyone is interested in that. So the CLCPA contains language that the DEC, in cooperation with other agencies and in consultation with the Climate Justice Working Group, should prepare what they're calling a barriers and opportunities report on barriers to and opportunities for access to or community ownership of 5 different services and commodities. So barriers to and opportunities for these services in disadvantaged communities. And the services are on the right. So distributed renewable energy, energy efficiency and weatherization, low emission transportation, resilience and adaptation, and services and infrastructure to reduce health risks from climate-related hazards. This report needs to be submitted by January 1st, 2022, and its purpose is to feed into the draft scoping plan. And you've heard all this before. I'm just kind of sharing for those who may be listening in here. So let's go to the next slide here. So let's go 2 slides forward and then we'll come back. So we kicked off this project, one back. If you go one back to the summary of research. So reverse, yeah, thank you. So we kicked off this project kind of in August or mid-August and did a lot of research over the past few months. And thank you so much for all of your help sharing these research and public input opportunities with your constituents and colleagues. We were able to complete 8 focus groups and heard from 65 people overall in 90-minute sessions. The DEC hosted 2 public hearings and had 97 attendees. We received and are still processing a number of written public comments from the general public as well as organizations. And a big part of this work, especially on the barrier side, was reviewing so many existing reports, plans, and proceedings, including a lot of agency proceedings and community-based organization reports from New York. And the DEC and NYSERDA have also been working with several agencies to kind of vet some of these ideas and provide input along the way. So at this point, what we're doing is we're really in the middle of analysis and synthesis of everyone's ideas to try to develop recommendations and principles for the Barriers and Opportunities report. We do have a working draft of barriers that was largely based on secondary research that we're kind of updating from the research, and Samir did distribute that, and we're really focused right now on principles and recommendations. So let's reverse 1 slide. And before I kind of ask for some discussion, I want to, with Samir's help, just kind of clarify how this report differs from and relates to the draft scoping plan. Kind of our interpretation, the agency's interpretation, is that it's meant to be recommendations for agencies and other organizations to implement the strategies in the scoping plan to improve access to or community ownership of services and commodities. So in our understanding of how this fits in, this is really about the how of implementing the strategies in the scoping plan, kind of assuming that and hoping that the strategies that you provided feedback on and the strategies that you submitted to the CAC, you might be implemented in the future. If they were implemented, how would the agencies and other organizations implement them equitably and implement them such that disadvantaged communities have increased access, use, and ownership of those things? So we're kind of thinking about your input on the advisory panel recs and the recommendations that will be in the scoping plan as the what of the plan, and this is kind of about the how of reaching and serving disadvantaged community members. Samir, do you want to talk a little bit more about how this fits in with the scoping plan?
Yeah, thanks. And it fits in with the scoping plan in that it's going to be an implementation guide. Like, you know, the scoping plan may include objectives like increase access to everybody to low emissions transportation. And then it's a question of, well, how are we going to do that? And this report will provide that how we can actually achieve the objectives. And just so everybody knows, kind of the next step, immediately as this report is released, we'll begin phase 2 of the work, where we'll visit the recommendations with every relevant program team and also consult with all of you again on in kind of revisiting these and refining it. And then by the end of next year, as the scoping plan is finalized, the final version of this will get merged into the scoping plan, which will provide the thrust, the policy substance, and then this is like how we'll actually reach every community with the benefits that we have to. And you know, that could be tailored strategies, and well, I'm sure all of you know that. But yeah.
Thank you. Any questions on how this fits in? Okay, Alana, let's go 2 slides forward now to that green slide. So where we are today, we're trying to pull this draft together by December 3rd is our timeline for this draft. And we have, working frameworks of both the barriers and the opportunities, but really want to understand from you what you really think is important and you want to see emphasized in the report, especially in the line of principles, recommendations, or guidelines. And, I know that there's so much written already, the HEMAS principles and principles and recommendations that your organizations have written, and we are reviewing those, and those are integrated into our draft framework. But we don't really have the full framework to share today since it's still kind of in development. So I was hoping we could use this time to just, if you're interested at this time or provide in writing, the first question here is to think of your kind of top 1 to 3 principles on or recommendations for how to increase community or community member access, use, or ownership of those 5 services or commodities in the CLCPA. Again, thinking about implementation guidelines rather than policy or programmatic ideas. So that's kind of the main thing that we would like to do in the remaining time on this topic. And then we also, Samir shared the draft barriers framework, which we have here and could talk about as well, or you can submit written feedback. And just in terms of, written feedback, that's completely optional. No need to do that, but an option if you want to do that before Thanksgiving would be appreciated.
And Amanda, sorry, one thing I forgot to mention, this may be obvious, but the how is also just outreach. And if you want to provide an incentive, how do you tailor that incentive so that it reaches everybody? And then you all may have ideas on that. So
yeah. So yeah, I'd love if just to open the floor now for any ideas you might have along the line of this number 1 of kind of top principles or recommendations you really want to make sure arise and are emphasized in this document. If you want to share anything now. Looks like most people are on mute. And if this might be a little open-ended, we can also share the draft framework. I didn't want to, throw that up until people had a chance to chime in. Rawa, do you want to say something?
Sorry. I didn't realize I was off of mute, but no, I don't have anything to say. I'm still kind of just taking this all in.
Okay. Would it be helpful to kind of see some really high level draft ideas as a starting point. Or do you rather take this back and kind of think about this and provide written feedback?
I think it would be helpful to see some of the draft ideas. This is Amy.
All right, well, let's go to the next slide. So we have one slide with very high level draft ideas on the next slide. And then this is the draft barriers framework. So let me talk about this first, and then we'll go to the draft ideas and decide where you want to start. So this is about barriers to access, use, and community ownership of those 5 clean energy and climate services and commodities. So one big category dealing with physical and economic structures and conditions, like the age and disrepair of the building stock, multifamily and rental structures, the split incentive problem, product and service availability, physical infrastructure limitations, and any data related limitations. The second big category is financial and knowledge resources and capacity barriers. And this is, so I also want to say that all these barriers could have different meaning for individuals and households, small and local businesses, and organizations. So if you think of this second category, lack of access to capital or financing, that could apply to an individual, a household, or an organization, and the report will provide examples of how these barriers exist and what they mean to different types of people and organizations, because we're trying to have the report both speak to barriers and opportunities for individuals and households, as well as community-based organizations and local and municipal governments, because both have a huge opportunity to, access and use a lot of the programs and services that will come out of the CLCPA. So just going back here, the financial and knowledge resources and capacity barriers, that second item about lack of time or planning capacity, very relevant for individuals and people, lack of time to look into, to deal with program requirements, to sit on the phone with customer service to deal with an application. Also relevant to a small organization that might not have staff to look for or apply for grants, which gets into staff resources, lack of access to personal or professional or information networks that might be helpful to find out about or navigate opportunities, community programmatic and information capacity limitations, and the big category of workforce constraints, indicating the need for training. The third category here is about perceptions and informational barriers. Uncertainty or lack of awareness about risks or needs. For example, so much information now about, climate change and flooding risks, new maps, new resources all the time, and, communities trying to get their heads around what their risks may be. Lack of trust in programs or service providers. For example, not understanding, being able to wade through all of the marketing for, community solar utility programs, things like that. Perceptions that a certain item or solution might be valuable or worth the effort or cost. And then the big category of just information not being provided in the best channel, source, language, or format. So the way information is shared just really not being aligned, not being designed with or for disadvantaged community members. And then the last category gets into a lot of the programmatic design and implementation barriers. So again, some things on limited information, the big category of a program or offer not really being designed for disadvantaged community members, the idea that sometimes things might be kind of designed or envisioned for homeowners and then tried to be, applied to renters as an example. Program eligibility constraints is a big one, just the challenge of documentation and different programs having different requirements. insufficient or inconsistent program resources, both, to offer the program and then to help people through the program, frustration and lack of program coordination, not being able to necessarily get an answer for something. And then, a big category of insufficient outreach or outreach that doesn't really align with the places people are and the channels and information they're monitoring. So actually, I'll stop there. I love feedback on this if you have any immediate feedback. Otherwise, still happy for written feedback.
Amanda, I have one item that I feel maybe isn't quite yet captured in here. Around the physical and economic structures and conditions, I wonder if there needs to be an acknowledgement of displacement or forced migration, and maybe how that impacts who is investing in which buildings and where, and who's able to do that.
That is great. Thank you for noting that. We heard that a lot in focus groups, this awareness that displacement and forced migration is an option on the table and being discussed, and, a big concern about it. So we definitely want to flag that in the recommendations and opportunities, and I'll find a way to make sure that's reflected here as well. Anyone else see anything missing or anything that isn't quite capturing what you think the big ideas are?
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm so sorry. I'm having all kinds of trouble with my laptop. So I can't hear out of one bud. I can only hear out of one bud. So for what it's worth, I'm not gonna say much other than one thing that I'm not seeing here as a barrier, especially if what we're all anticipating is that there's going to be a need for stronger government, nonprofit, and other entity partnerships if we're going to grapple with the enormous challenges that we all know with grappling with. There is the ongoing problem of just procurement policies that have, I think, not been updated in some cases in decades. There are all sorts of procurement and conflicts of, purported conflicts of interest barriers that were introduced either at the city level or state level, a long time ago to deal with, necessary corruption issues at the time. I don't believe that procurement policies have been revisited. And as a result, it's what's that old saying that to a hammer everything's a nail, right? And I think that part of the problem is that the procurement policies have been the hammer that have not realized that they have prevented all sorts of nonprofit and smaller grassroots groups from participating because of dated procurement policies, and as well as how monies flow from government agencies to nonprofits. So I'm just flagging that's a real issue that we hear from at least NEJA. We have 11 community-based organizational members across the city, and we hear that from our members all the time. So I'll stop there for now, because that's the one thing I didn't see listed here, which was the inaccessibility of procurement policies, making it difficult for grassroots groups to access resources.
Thank you.
Sorry, Eddie, could you elaborate on what type of procurement you're talking about? Because I mean, in my mind, obviously there's grants, but I don't know about something else.
Well, let's start. Since you opened it, let's start with grants, right? So, I don't know if Uprose is on the line, and if so, if they want to speak to the problem they had with the EJ grant program. So, if I'm sorry, Elizabeth, I'm not seeing if she's on. Yeah, I think she's on.
I'm on.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually was thinking about something else, Eddie. I was thinking about how when we were talking to DOT about using local companies that have cement to build permeable surfaces, they told us that it depended on the procurement policies, that it was possible
that the cement and the resources to build locally here would be coming from the Bronx, and that the procurement policies were really dated, and it didn't make sense for me to be using materials from another borough to build locally in terms of sustainability. So I thought that's what, that's what we were in part talking about. What are you referring to?
And I was talking about the Greenwood Cemetery getting a $50,000 EJ grant.
Oh, yeah.
So
No, yeah,
yeah.
we were really shocked. We were shocked because, this was a classic example of the environmental justice leadership and community making resources available so that we can operationalize just transition and do remediation, environmental remediation, and then the resources going to the cemetery, that the cemetery with no connection or relationship with the community saw EJ resources as an opportunity for them to do the work that they do and to do an end run around EJ leadership to other organizations that in our community were white led so that they could get those resources, and DEC let that happen. And so, yeah, that's what happened. The cemetery got the grant to do environmental justice work.
So that right there is an example of a procurement and that's actually a slightly different model than what I was referring to, but that's an example of a program that was designed for EJ community-based organizations, right? And the decision to grant what is purportedly an EJ grassroots CBO pot of money to a large, to an enormous cemetery just raises questions about what are the procurement policies. Even when we have a program that's designed for us, resources are not honored to the local EJ group, right? But what I'm talking about specifically is, challenges I've heard from people over the years about accessing brownfield remediation funding from the Department of State, or accessing there was an ICERTA program. I'd have to go back and find out from the group what the procurement challenge was. But I think that across the board there are, and maybe this is something you guys can even talk to the controller's office about, but there have been my experiences, there have been whether it's grant programs or other programs where resources can flow, that oftentimes it's dated procurement policies that prevent groups that are otherwise doing great work from accessing them. Does that help, Samir?
So Eddie, I just wanted to
Yeah.
say that with the Brownfield Opportunity Area Program, I think is a perfect example of how the environmental justice community was able to get those resources so that they could be involved in community-based planning and brownfield remediation. And then after we were able to get that done, the money was then just given to municipalities, and they became the lead and the deciders. Maybe I'm feeling a little cynical today, but I just feel like we invest a lot of time and a lot of resources, and then our organizations and our communities are not prioritized, and we just put wealth back into the pockets of the privileged. So that can happen with this. That's the risk that we're going to take, because when everyone says for all doesn't include leveling the playing field, having a commitment to civil rights and human rights, and prioritizing communities of color and EJ leadership. So unless that's done, all this work that we've done is going to benefit people who literally are going to be, who are going to be engaged in savior behavior. And so even when we spoke to the DC about it, we were pretty much blown off when we raised the question of the cemetery getting the EJ funding. So anyway, just something that we need to be aware of, that if we're not prioritized, if we're not in the language, it's just not going to happen for us. We will have wasted a lot of time to make empire building organizations even bigger on the backs of our communities.
Thank you.
That helps clarify.
I have a question. This is Rawa.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess my question is, has there been any conversation about how do you integrate these concerns? Because electrification is moving so quickly. As the draft plan says that we have to, no new buildings have fossil fuels by 2024. So I guess the question really is, since the barriers are so big, and of course the change is going to happen very rapidly, how do you integrate community ownership into electrification?
It's a great question. When you say community ownership there, one thing we have, been discussing is what exactly that means. So in that context, what are you thinking of as community ownership? What type of community ownership would you like to see in that integration or in that effort?
That's a really good question. So I see, if you're asking me, I mean, I don't know if it's the place to start, but for me, it's if we're going to have, for example, renewable energy projects, things like heat pumps going into the buildings, like we want to be able to own, maintain, and install and or build these systems within our frontline community. We have the knowledge, we don't have the financing to make that happen. And we also need a little bit of time to then train the workforce that would do that. And so how it's worked generally is it ends up being like a chicken or the egg problem, right? Is we've done things like prepare a workforce that then the jobs aren't quite there yet for, right? So then that causes issues because we're working with challenged populations. And then similarly, where we have the ideas for innovation around some of these ownership structures, like having a community solar, like owning a 1 gigawatt community or megawatt community solar project that could be an incredible workforce opportunity for our trainees that then would get actually connected to work, that where we would be doing the operations and maintenance of that, also being the technicians, being the subscription managers, and then providing up to 150 or 300 community members the credits so that they are, we're removing the barriers. So it's a way to grow community wealth, and then bringing community control of the resources as well as the community ownership aspects of it. And these kinds of systems, if we were to get, say, a couple of $1 million of cash influx at the outset as a forgivable loan to a community like ours, then they could generate revenue. We could use that revenue not only to employ people long term, but also take some of those savings and either give them back to community residents as dividends, or we could build other new systems, use it as pre-development to build newer systems.
Thank you. Wow. I think we're hoping that, the report can kind of highlight some of that, maybe not at that level of detail. Samir, to what extent does the scoping plans strategies cover some of those ideas of, programmatic tactics or workforce development ideas?
Well, I was actually going to say part of what I think a good portion of what you said, Arawa, feels like a more scoping planish comment. And so off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that question, but let's capture that and either appropriately put it as a scoping plan consideration or something for the barriers report. But just in terms of operationalizing this stuff, Ra, which is I think part of what you talked about, Chris, you may have more to add to this, but that's going to be over the course of next year, is really, taking these recommendations at the level that they're at and then working with our program teams on setting goals to integrate them into their work, further refining them, and then, look forward to consulting with you on that. And then it'll get merged into the scoping plan. So anyway, that's just some more context, but yeah, thanks for that comment. I thought it was useful.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I think my comment wasn't to go into like the granular, but really just to kind of address the integration aspects of it. And so these things need to happen simultaneously.
No, I think your comment was extremely valuable for showing the end-to-end process and how things need to be integrated, which leads into kind of recommendations on, integration.
Real quick.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Robin.
My question just was, you brought up the scoping plan's been raised a lot. So when do you think we'll be able to see a draft of that?
Samir, what are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, definitely by the end of the year, I know that like it's being looked at by individual council members, and people are like offering the input into what it is. So I think by early January, I guess more precisely, is when you'll be able to see it, and then obviously, yeah, I mean, you can further refine it at that point. I think there's going to be a meeting. I could be wrong, but I think we're going to hold a meeting specifically with the Climate Justice Working Group in early January on the scoping plan.
Thanks.
I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
I think we have about 5 minutes left here. I would love to share the next slide, which is the draft principles and opportunities framework, just as food for thought. This is really still drafted, very much in development and a little bit higher level than what you just saw, but there will be a lot more details under this. So this is kind of the first 2 levels. And then within each of these bullets, there will actually be 3 to 6 different sub-recommendations and tangible examples. So kind of the overarching categories here are everything related to including people more and including more people. So real co-design of programs and projects with and for disadvantaged community members and organizations. Continuing to talk about what does real meaningful public input mean? What are truly meaningful opportunities for public input, specifically in government processes and proceedings? And then the third thing is, more cross-cutting collaboration, getting different types of people and organizations to the table, whether that's different organizations within a town or cross-municipal collaboration, as well as any kind of as Eddie said, procurement processes, grant processes that are needed to encourage and at least not disincentivize different towns collaborating with each other, different organizations. Second big category, nothing groundbreaking here, but truly make everything easier to navigate and access. So starting with looking for opportunities to transition from kind of opt-in program models that that people have to work a lot to find and apply to thinking of where things can be switched or flipped to automatic or opt-out models, or at least automatic kind of referral or eligibility. So requiring just much less effort to participate. Continuing to talk about more people-centered policies, programs, and funding. Just in the sense of, centering people first on how they're going to navigate through a process. What are the, combination of issues they're trying to solve? It's, access to medical appointments and transportation and navigating public transportation with a disability. Think of that whole network of things and how they might navigate that. And then finding and supporting resource-constrained communities from end to end. So kind of purposefully in this order, thinking about where possible, maybe there's opportunities that things don't require so much effort for grant applications. But of course, a lot of things do require a lot of local effort. And so how can we support grassroots organizations and municipal governments in finding both human and financial resources. And then we really did want to talk about, there's some things that came out that we heard really strongly that kind of fit into the things above, but we wanted to call them out separately. So calling out opportunities to mobilize and facilitate citizen participation and action. So how can agencies really listen for and hear everything people see and notice, and create better pathways for them to have their voices heard. So, people noticing local flooding, what do they do with that information? People noticing code violations, what do they do with that information? Noticing a lot of trees that have fallen recently, how do they become part of the process? And then we heard so much about housing affordability, housing conditions, and housing quality, and how that relates to the energy and climate crisis, and how in some people's words the climate crisis is a housing crisis. So principles or recommendations about housing as well. I know that was a lot and a lot to think about. Definitely happy and would love written comments, but if anyone wants to say anything now, we'd love to hear it.
Amanda,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, it's Elizabeth. Yeah, the word meaningful means that people have access to the resources so that they can engage in the conversation at the same level as people, with a formal education. And in a society that focuses on the individual versus the collective, I think it's really important that that you can make the connection between building the capacity of EJCJ organizations to be sort of a clearinghouse of information where people can go. How individuals in the community are going to navigate their way through systems to find out information when there's been flooding, when there's been, any kind of disruption as a result of climate, is going to be different depending on their ability, their own personal capacity to access those resources. So built in, there has to be a place and places, hubs, centers where people who are coming from a place where they either don't know how to navigate through their systems, maybe don't speak the language or don't trust, can go to. Because if we just focus on, if we separate organizations from community, you're not going to get the kind of meaningful engagement. So I don't know, maybe that's in there. I feel like you touched on it, but I think we need to be more explicit.
No, I really appreciate that, and I appreciate hearing how you're, thinking about it and wording it. And we definitely want to emphasize that.
And Amanda, this is Abby. My comment is actually more on the previous slide than this slide. But just, looking at that list of barriers that you have, what really jumps out at me is that many or most of them are, outcomes of systemic racism and white supremacy culture. And I'm wondering if there was, if there was room to explicitly call that out, or if there was kind of an intentional decision to not go there. And the reason I ask is because then, kind of piggybacking on what Elizabeth just said, what does that mean in terms of investment and leveling the playing field? Yeah, that's all.
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's going to be a separate section in the report that kind of addresses that as, background and context of why we're here and why we're talking about this, and what exactly that looks like in New York as the, backdrop for that. Samir, anything else on that idea?
No, I don't really have anything more to add. I mean, thanks for bringing that up. I see how that overlays.
I'm not sure if it fits in any of these. Elizabeth, I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about what appeared to be a barrier that Uprose was facing in looking at its cooperatively owned solar project. There was a specific Con Ed barrier that I think in the revitalized partnership that we have with Push and the Point, we've heard several times have come up. And this may not be the time and place to share it, but you know what I'm talking about? Like that's yet another, the role that Con Ed plays can be a barrier.
Yeah,
deployment. Sorry.
Yeah, I think Summer from our office can share specific information about what those were, but I can tell you generally we had this goal to bring in different kinds of partnerships, faith-based, community-based, the EDC, and also individuals who were in business to install community-owned solar. And we had one resident who bought a building and gave up and invested in putting in solar, and with the idea that there would be community ownership. And most of the time that that couple spent in trying to make that happen was with the obstacles that they faced with Con Ed. We also had a lot of obstacles with Con Ed, but we're happy to put those in an email and send them, and you guys can share them so that it doesn't take up too much of the time here. But yeah, it was it was almost like everything else, even getting pre-development costs, everything else was easier than navigating our way through the challenges that Con Ed presented.
Yeah, thank you. We would love to see anything you can, you or Summer can provide on that. That would be helpful. Well, thank you. We would love to talk more about this. I think we can move on to the next topic, but we'll definitely review the notes pretty carefully from this discussion. And if you want to email Samir any other thoughts, high level, detailed, your choice, feel free.
All right, so I'm gonna kind of go through this really quickly for everybody. So what you're seeing on the screen right now is just a definition of for disadvantaged communities and what the charge of the Climate Justice Working Group is with regards to, hold on a second, I gotta pull some things out. There's some things on my screen. Regards to what we should be doing and the purpose for establishing the criteria to identify the communities, that the goal is for co-pollutant reductions, greenhouse gas emissions, for investments, regulatory impact statements, and emissions reductions. The 40% benefits goal. So we understand that, the 35 that's stated in the legislation. Hello, somebody seen? Somebody? Does someone have a question or want to jump in? Okay, sorry. Okay. So for just for the 40% goal, we've discussed it, that it should be considered the minimum, and that there is still 60% of the funding is always available for other communities that don't fall into disadvantaged communities or are a bit higher or middle income. So we are always cognizant of that when we're thinking of that. Agencies and authorities, we are having conversations right now to discuss exactly how that's going to work and what that's going to look like. I mentioned before that we are trying to come up with a plan, but this is going to look a little bit different for each agency, since agencies versus authorities, we have different funding streams and different ways we are permitted to use our funding. But we are going to try to make sure that we have something that is easily digestible by the public so that everybody knows what each agency, authority, or corporation, et cetera, is doing and how the funding can be accessed. So that's something that we're working on, and we hope to have something very soon that folks can easily digest. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, Lana, it's Eddie.
Hi, Eddie.
Hi, apologies. I don't know. There was a door knock, so I wasn't sure if this was addressed in a previous slide. One of the outstanding questions that we've had as the Climate Justice Working Group, and in fact, not just questions, but a recommendation that we've made repeatedly, both on these calls as well as in the policy feedback that we gave. I'm trying to remember for which, maybe it was more than one, which is the question of direct investments versus benefits. Where is that in the agency calculus, in the conversations? Again, we've made the case, and in fact, the original version of CLCPA called for direct investments, and then it got changed to the squishier benefits language, which is making everybody's life, I'm assuming at the agency level as well, more complicated than it needs to be. Where is that investment versus benefits conversation? How is that playing out? And will you all be able to give some clarity as to that, where you land on that debate, and when we might expect that decision?
Chris, did you want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, I can take that. So yeah, Eddie. So at the agency level, we are, kind of aligning around looking at investments as the primary, benefit metric that we would count.
Yay!
We want to make sure that we're still kind of, accounting for and reporting on other, impacts or co-benefits of those investments. So that'll be, part of what we want to make sure is included in the public accounting and reporting of the investments. But we are actually kind of looking towards the next Climate Justice Working Group meeting to kind of talk through the place where we're landing as a state, on this topic. So there's still a few loose ends that we're trying to work through, but the idea would be at one of our next, if not the next working group meeting, we could come with kind of the full thinking and socialize that with the full working group.
Thanks so much, Chris. That's great to hear. And just a follow-up question, because I heard the distinction between agency and authority, and I'm just wondering, in this case, I'm hoping NYSERDA is seeing itself in the agency bucket less than the authority bucket, although I know it's an authority, mostly because that's where most of the clean energy funding goes through NYSERDA. So, it'd be helpful for all of us if that's where a NYSERDA may be leaning. I know you guys probably still have to have internal conversations, but in the case of investment versus benefits, where agencies may be leaning more towards direct investments, can we put the thumb on the NYSERDA scale to make it land on the agency side of things, or where do you guys see your specific agency, NYSERDA itself in that divide?
Yeah, so I think that the real kind of distinction is it a clean energy or an energy efficiency investment, right? So NYSERDA, so we expect that our investments, our portfolios would be part of the accounting and the thinking here. So I wouldn't make that distinction, with respect to agencies versus authorities, just when it comes to what dollars count. So I think we want to make sure that all dollars that are clean energy or energy efficiency that are able to be kind of directed or tracked back to projects within a community are counted. But we could dig into that a lot, in a lot more detail at the next working group meeting.
Thanks, Chris.
Hopefully that's helpful. Yep.
Absolutely. No, thank
Did anybody else have anything on this before we move forward? Chris loves answering questions, so we want to make sure everybody gets an opportunity to ask him. All right,
Yep.
I'm going to move forward.
For sure.
So with the legislative criteria, this, if you're looking at it, and I added in so folks could sort of see the definition, obviously for disadvantaged community are communities that bear negative public effects, environmental pollution, impacts of climate change, possess certain socioeconomic criteria, or are high concentrations of low and moderate income households. So obviously, we know that that's the criteria that we're dealing with. Section 750111C discusses exactly how that is going to be identified. It's going to be based on geographic, public health, environmental hazard, and socioeconomic data. Just to sort of let folks know that there was a little bit of a question as to how to make that definition between the agencies. And like I said before, we've kind of determined that we can, there was a question, and I don't mind, I think it's okay to bring it up, right, Chris? We're fine talking about it. Okay, so the issue was whether or not we could use the individual household criteria is in the definition of disadvantaged communities. There was a question of legislative interpretation, difference between DEC and NYSERDA. We have determined that individual, I will say DEC was saying that individual criteria couldn't be used. But we are fine with using this individual criteria definition for strictly the purposes of determining the socioeconomic criteria and determining the benefits and investments language. So we, like I said, prior to that, we did have a little bit of a disagreement there just with regards to the definition, and that's why the meeting was postponed, so we could come to an agreement on that. We have come to an agreement, and so we are fine moving forward. Does anybody have any questions?
Alana, this is Chris, and maybe just to kind of to flag. Oh, sorry, Eddie, do you want to go ahead?
Hey, so sorry. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
I don't know if and I don't know if Chris there was a recent very recent DEC permitting decision in Sunset Park that I'm sure Uprose would want to share. I think there is a problem with I think that there are decision makers within the agencies that are not clear about this exact language. Communities that bear the burdens of negative health impacts, environmental pollution. This, I'm assuming that these criteria applied not just obviously to funding, but it also was supposed to apply to permitting decisions. Let me just stop there. And Chris, were you going to talk about something directly related to the household versus community? Because I'm sure Uprose will raise the transfer station example after that, because I don't want to take us off that point if that's what you were going to talk about.
Yeah, I was just going to flag that. The main kind of the main issue related to kind of the individual criteria was, we didn't want to constrain the working group in terms of what where the working group would want to land in terms of identifying the criteria. So that was the the outcome there. So but in terms of how and where that applies, I know, and I don't know if Alana or the DEC team want to speak to it, but I think that's still a question. So I don't know on the DEC and if you want to take that one.
Right now, it is still a question based on our interpretation of the legislation. It's something that we will definitely need to go through more internally, but we didn't want to hold up any discussion on it too long. We didn't want to prevent the vote from going through based, we didn't want to hold that up. So we are going to have more internal discussions on it, but we wanted to be able to move forward with using that criteria at the very least for determining benefits and investments and for the DAC criteria.
Alana, I'm so sorry. I don't know if the rest of the working group is understanding. I'm not. So I'm just no. It's in the world of it's not you, it's me. It's always me. So don't worry. But
no. I might not be explaining it well. It's okay.
No, not at all. I just want to make sure for the rest of the working group members, what I'm hearing is that the central debate that we've been having now for the last couple of months as to household versus neighborhood wide, there is an interpretation issue that's risen within DEC. Can you explain to us what, in just layman's terms, what is the disagreement and what should we as the working group do about it? And the reason I'm saying this is that I just need to, if I'm wondering if there is a legal threshold question, which is why you guys have the legislative language up on the screen. Like, clearly there's a legal interpretation question that is not being, I'm not understanding what, and I think the rest of the working group would probably appreciate it, unless the rest of the working group understands, and then I'll just, I'll shut up.
Now, can I just ask a question
Yeah,
also?
go ahead. Sure.
So in addition to not understanding how it's being interpreted, I wonder if DEC has actually trained their staff on how to apply the CLCPA and what Eddie was referring to before, which is something that has really sort of has us looking at DC a little differently, because I think there's just too many inconsistencies. DC granted a permit to a waste company that would increase the amount of tonnage of C&D waste in Sunset Park, 1,075 tons of C&D waste a day in Sunset Park, in a community that is not only looking for green reindustrialization, but collectively, everything from our elected officials to all of our organizations said that we didn't want it. In a community where so many people die from COVID, and that are literally now more susceptible to the PM 2.5 and the co-pollutants that are going to be coming out of the tonnage of waste. And so, you know, it's difficult to hear DEC talking about, well, we care about frontline communities, and, you know, we want to monitor and assess the health profile of these communities and determining what's a disadvantaged community, because we want to apply the CLCPA, and we know that these are the communities that are susceptible. Well, that's really great press, but in action, this decision was just made like 2 weeks ago, and it has a disparate impact in an EJ community. And when we met with DEC folks, it didn't seem like they really understood what the mandates are of CLCPA, or that they had ever gotten any training or an orientation on how to apply this to permitting. So,
Yeah,
so we have questions about that as well.
and specifically what I heard from the UPROS team, and Elizabeth, let me know if I'm stating this incorrectly. What I heard from the UPROS team was that the explanation from DEC as to why they didn't apply CLCPA consideration to this permit is because the CLCPA deals with greenhouse gas emission reduction, not co-pollutant reduction, which is clearly not wrong. I mean, just clearly wrong. Co-pollutant language and emissions reduction mandates for co-pollutants are throughout the CLCPA. And if DEC staff is saying that greenhouse gas emissions are the only emissions that matter on the CLCPA, it's raising some really serious questions. And by the way, it's not, I don't want to just pick, I'm not looking to pick on DEC. I think that the scope of what the CLCPA's intent is only now starting to be understood by agencies. And we've seen numerous examples of agency counsel trying to push back with, shall we say, fanciful interpretations of CLCPA that would not stand up in a court of law. Stuff like, you know, the PSC, the CLCPA doesn't apply to Public Service Commission decisions, stuff like that. There is a troubling, icy pattern emerging where you have agencies that are only now starting to realize the scope of CLCPA and are trying to reverse engineer their way out of it. And I got to tell you, I'm seeing lawsuits on the horizon, and that's not where any of us want to be. So hence the Elizabeth's opening remark, which is, you know, what training is happening, or what, and it seems to me that the interpretation of CLCPA changes from day to day, agency to agency, depending which lawyer is talking about what permit application on any given day. It's a problem, and let me just stop right there. And we haven't even gotten to the household versus community question that this slide triggered. So I want to make sure we get to that, obviously, but these are two dynamics that are causing some concern for us.
And if there's a training or an orientation to provide clarity and to make sure that there is consistency throughout these agencies, we're going to want to see those. We're going to see what they say and what they look like, what people are being told about how to make these kinds of decisions? What is the guidance that they're getting? What does that guidance look like?
Okay, to deal with the first question about the individual households, what we're doing is we're sort of not separating, but the definition is definitely for whether or not we could include individual household criteria within the definition of disadvantaged communities, since it does state that it's based on geographic data, and then we have to question whether or not that includes in populations, whether or not that actually includes individual households. So there was a little bit of question as to that. We determined that for the purposes of determining disadvantaged communities for, investments, for targeting for investments and benefits, that we could use that criteria. But as it applies to permitting, whether or not that individual criteria can be used, that is still being determined by DEC. We still need to discuss that internally about how that individual criteria would even work, or if it could work for permitting. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Alana, what does that mean, individual permitting? I'm not
individual
lost.
criteria. So, for example, if we're looking at individual household criteria, individual households for the definition of disadvantaged communities, can an individual household be considered a disadvantaged community with regards to permitting versus versus a community, versus a geographical area?
Yeah, I think we're mixing two different things. The individual versus the household versus community thing is about investments. Let's put that aside. We're talking, the other thing that we talked about was permitting. Here's a permitting decision by DEC where what was stated, and I haven't looked at the record of this. I haven't looked at the actual permit language from DEC. All I can tell you is what I heard from the UPROS team following a verbal conversation with DEC was that the explanation why they did not apply CLCPA reasoning to reject the permit was that they said that CLCPA deals with greenhouse gas emissions, not co-pollutants, which is clearly wrong. So that's a permitting decision. I'm happy if we want to talk about the investment conversation first, because that's been the thing that's been holding up the working group now over the summer, frankly. But we are raising a different issue, which is what are agency people being told is the applicability to CLCPA to permitting decisions. If co-pollutants is part of the law, it needed to be part of DEC's permitting decision. And that's what I'm telling you is that we're hearing, and that's just one example. We've heard other examples of other agency counsel that are, creatively interpreting CLCPA, and that's got to stop. Like, there needs to be a uniform standard to how CLCPA is applied to permits. Otherwise, this is going to make a mockery of what has now become the nation's leading law on climate change. So if we could separate those two conversations about the investment part, individual versus community, and this permitting issue, that would be much appreciated.
So Eddie, it's Jared. I'd like to just jump in for a moment. And so we take our obligations under the CLCPA, very seriously, and that includes, considering impacts on disadvantaged communities in permitting decisions. I'm not aware of the specific permit in Sunset Park that you've been describing. If you can, probably Elizabeth, if you can tell me the name of the facility, I'm happy to look into it. Because it sounds like there's some miscommunication there. So
hey, Jared, I really appreciate it, Jared. I think Elizabeth offline will be happy to share. I guess what I'm saying is there's the specific permit, and then there's this issue, Jared, which is a broader issue, which is do DEC administrative law judges and permitting staff, do they all realize that they have to take co-pollutants as defined under the CLCPA into account in their permitting decisions? So there's a specific example, but then there's a larger question of has DEC started looking at its permitting and understanding that it's not just greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, and Eddie, that's why I want to understand, what the facility is. I agree with you that Section 7.3 of the CLCPA is not limited to greenhouse gases. Disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged communities, and in fact, the second sentence in that provision specifically refers to co-pollutants. So, let me sort of go back and see what happened there. But we fully understand that the concern about disproportionate impacts is primarily the co-pollutants as opposed to the greenhouse gas emissions.
Jared, I just want to, I want to thank Eddie for lifting this. To be honest, I felt really uncomfortable even coming onto this call because I felt a certain amount of cynicism about believing in a system that could be so inconsistent and harm a community like Sunset Park. I was so blown away by the decision because we had scientists, we had experts, we had lawyers all testify. We had consensus from the entire community. And the fact that this is going to happen just blocks away where we had 4 trucks with refrigerated bodies of COVID deaths just felt like an assault on Sunset Park. So I actually didn't even want to get on this call. So I just want to thank Eddie for raising it for me, Eddie, because I didn't even know how to bring this into this conversation. And also thank you for raising the fact that people are not getting the same information and that the communities that this is supposedly be trying to protect are communities that are being put in harm's way. So anyway, I just wanted to say that, Jared, because it has affected how our organization, how this organization is now thinking about a DEC. So
yes. And Elizabeth, thank you very much for that. And that's unfortunate, because, from the top down, we take this really seriously. And, and I think that sort of goes to the question about investments and other provisions in permitting, in rule writing, in developing the scoping plan, that all through that entire process, it is important to consider impacts and avoid the disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged communities and achieve, reductions in co-pollutants in those communities. And, I can't emphasize enough how important that is to DEC in this process. We take it very seriously. So, I'll follow up on that. I think on the question of households, I think we're sort of getting to it here, on this discussion about Sunset Park. That's a community that is impacted. It sort of is a community that meets all these words in the statute that you see here, and that's why it is important that we have a definition of disadvantaged communities that we can apply in this permitting context, in this rulemaking context, in development of the scoping plan. And so the household criteria make a lot of sense when we're looking at investments. They maybe don't apply the same way when we're engaged in permitting that are these place-based decisions. And that's where it's really, what is the cumulative impact on the community. And so, I think that's sort of what Alana's getting at, and Chris, and, about, this definition being applicable to investments. We'd also like to apply it, perhaps without the household criteria for the rest of the decisions we make, because it would be valuable guidance to us. Right now we don't have a definition of disadvantaged communities, so we do have the interim definition that we're referencing in our permitting and other decisions. So I'm sorry I spoke a lot there, but and I hope I didn't cause more confusion.
No, it's helpful, Jared. I would just say that I don't think that we have, and rest of the working group, please correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think any of us have ever said that we should apply individual households in a permitting. There'll be clearly community-wide
Right.
impacts when it comes to permitting. That's the bread and butter. That's EJ 101. That's what we've been doing like
Yeah.
for 30 years. But we were talking about the investments, right?
Yep.
And what I'm hearing, that's what we opened this section with, right? Which was like, it sounds like there is an I don't want to say obstacle is the right word, but there is an additional consideration that we need to take into account as a climate justice working group when it comes to applying investment criteria, whether we wanted to mix it up with individual households or keep it at a community-wide level. That's where we began, because it sounded like to me for the first time, and we had been debating this over the summer, that there is a new consideration that DEC has, and I'm just trying to understand what that is and how that might shape our thinking on this working group.
You know, Eddie, I think we see it the same way as you do. You know, so if the climate justice working group wants to include households and household, household income separately, in addition to the sort of geographically based criteria for investment purposes, that's great. And we don't have a problem with that at all. I think, and we agree with you, to the second part that permitting decisions and the like should be based on, the geographic considerations. And so I think we're in a good place. I think we see eye to eye on this. And so it really comes now to us to apply it consistently in the decisions we make.
And those are conversations that are occurring within the agency, is how to make sure that 7.3 specifically is applied and how to make sure that it's applied evenly and consistently. We do have, 9 regions, and we are trying to make sure that everybody is communicating, especially on this issue.
Yes, thank you, Alana.
But if there are, like I said, any issues like what's happening in Sunset Park, unfortunately, I apologize for not being aware of that issue. If anything, and I'll definitely be looking into it a lot more now. If anything like that comes up and there is concern, please reach out to me. Like I said, we have 9 regions, and we do depend on our regional staff to make us aware of any major issues that are occurring, and we trust them. So if there's anything that's happening that is concerning you and you don't think is being addressed appropriately, please absolutely reach out to me and let me know.
What's the history of why?
No, thanks so much for that. I guess that for the other working group members, are you, when it comes going back to the conversation about an individual household versus communities, are you all clear about what the caution is from DEC? If not, please say so.
Yeah, we can say it again if anybody has any questions or if it's still confusing.
If you could, this is Amy, if you could just repeat it again, that would be helpful.
Sure. So now we're talking about the individual household criteria. So when we're talking about the individual household criteria, the goal is to use that as the disadvantaged communities. The definition can include individual households for the purposes of investments and benefits. When it comes to, and again, this isn't necessarily, anything on the climate justice working group. This is more for us at the agency about the additional implications of the legislation. So while you were all very, clearly thinking individual households for the purposes of investments and benefits, there was some question as to whether or not that the implications could be wider for DEC with regards to permitting and siting. So we wanted to have a conversation about whether or not it could be applied, individual household criteria could be used only for that and not implicated in other places. So we wanted to make sure that we had an agreement on that before we move forward. We didn't want anybody thinking that we could move forward without knowing definitely that that's something that we were going to do, if that makes sense. We didn't want there to be this disagreement between the agencies and then to sort of pull the rug out under the working group and say, well, we're not considering individual household criteria anymore. So we wanted to make sure that we had an agreement on that. And that agreement is that it can be used for the definition of disadvantaged communities for the purposes of investments and benefits, but we are going to look into that further and how individual criteria could potentially impact other areas of DECL. Does that make sense?
This is Abby, and I'm sorry if I'm just being dense here.
No, it's fine.
So specifically about, does our definition have to be restricted to geographic areas? And so I'm thinking about, the question that we've been coming up over and over. What does this mean for rural communities?
I'm going to jump in and give the non-lawyer part and then have the lawyers correct me if I'm wrong. But the idea here is that the Climate Justice Working Group is the kind of defining group to help with the definition. Individual criteria is one option to add to the criteria, and that is okay for investments and benefits. So in that sense, yes, you can have an individual criteria added to the regionally geographic based criteria. You all good with that?
That sounds good. Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Cool. With that, I think we should move to the next couple slides. Okay, so this one, Alana, I could just kind of say was the idea here is, as always, it's really important for us to recognize that this is going to be the perfectly imperfect first draft, and that we absolutely need this to be updated and reviewed at least annually. And so this is a starting point for us. Okay, next slide. And the next one after that. What? Nope, go back.
That's okay.
Thank you. So please speak up as always. I want us to recap, because last time before this kind of individual criteria yes or no question came up, we actually made a lot of decisions and progress. And so I'm going to recap those and then discuss where we're at with the decisions we need to make before we get a vote. So we all agreed with the 44 indicators on the approach. We covered the idea that those indicators cover the balances of the pillars of the legislation. They cover what we've talked about as far as like the environment and the socio-demographic elements of things. We discussed the different kind of proportion that we want to designate, and everyone who was present voted, at least informally, to say that they would want a smaller proportion rather than a larger one to start with. And then there was a discussion about adding individual criteria and income, low income households to fill in the gaps. And again, that we would go every year and kind of iterate. We revisited the framing principles to really help make some of those decisions. So that is what we did last time we met. What that now leads us to is to discuss and confirm adding low-income households. How do we feel about the individual criteria? Where does it land? And we'll show you some kind of pictures about that and give you an idea of what's the coverage of New York State and stuff like that. So we're going to talk about that. And then if we do decide to do that, then we have to start thinking about how you define low-income households. And then also we have to land on a proportion of designated for the geographic definition using the kind of a special recipe that we've already agreed on with the indicators. Any questions on this? Okay, let's keep going. So this is just a recap because I think it's always good for us to have this every single time. We've got the population characteristics and health vulnerabilities, and then we've got the environmental burdens and climate change risks. What this does is we have three kind of main factors within the environmental burdens part. We multiply, kind of weight the potential climate risk because of trying to equalize everything within that group. And then on the other side, we've got income as a separate factor, race, ethnicity as a separate factor. Then we've got health, impacts and burdens, and then we've got housing, mobility, and communications as a separate one. And all of those are equal. But by separating out income and race, ethnicity, it gives it more weight individually in that. Questions here? Going too fast, just let me know. Okie dokie. Next slide. Want to revisit the framing principles just so that we have them, because I do think it will help to frame what decisions we have to make today and where we're kind of how far we are from a vote on this. So these were the kind of the critical things. I'm just going to read them off. We don't want to leave people most at risk of climate change crisis behind. Income is a very important indicator of the ability to respond and adapt. We want agencies to design and target efforts geographically to community scale or larger outreach and investments. And that is why a geographic, not just an individual criteria, is set and very important to this group. Initial investment should go to the hardest hit communities. This is that framing principle right there was why we then decided to kind of restrict a little bit of the proportion that we designate as a DAC. Consider who is least able to participate in transition to clean energy and clean energy economy. And then beware the unintended consequences. We don't want to create disadvantaged communities by redirecting funding too much toward one community over another. You all still there? Kicking with me?
Yes, except a quick question. I thought one of the framing principles, unless there's another, are there more framing principles on another slide? I don't mean to
Nope,
jump
this
in.
is it.
Was there a framing principle where we were encouraging, not encouraging, one of the things we talked about was getting a sense from NYSERDA and not I'm not saying NYSERDA just to pick on Chris because he's become one of our favorites, but it's not that. But you know, most of the kind of clean energy funding that I'm aware of, flows from through NYSERDA. I thought that one of the things we were looking for was a sense of, a breakdown of all of the clean energy funding that the state, oversees. What buckets of those lend themselves to household disbursement, right? Disbursement, whatever. In other words, I thought that I thought either that was a framing principle or at least a piece of calculus that I thought we needed to land on a decision that most of us that it would build consensus amongst all of us. So I thought there was an issue about the types of funding that is the household, and that a household designation lends itself more towards. And I'm probably butchering the question
No.
and the issue, but yeah.
You actually said it really, really succinctly and well. I think, yes, not a framing principle, but like homework for the agencies to do. And I know that some are working on kind of creating and looking through that. Chris, do you want to? I'm going to put you front and center because that's what we do. Any thought to the creation of that or ability to share that information?
Yeah, so that's something that we'll definitely have ready to put numbers to, beyond NYSERDA, next working group meeting. So as we kind of speak through what the, what the benefits framework, potentially could look like. We will be able to dig into kind of, on a budgetary level, what is currently allocated to those sorts of initiatives. I'll say kind of off the top of my head, because I don't have the numbers in front of me, but during the call I can pull them up. But I want to say, at NYSERDA, we probably have an annual budget of somewhere around $160 to $200 million that goes to household level initiatives. So whether that's energy efficiency retrofits or solar, so that would be roughly what the number looks like at NYSERDA. And then one of the areas that will be kind of important for us to think about as a working group is kind of this category of energy assistance, low-income energy assistance, which is essentially bill payment assistance grants, in the form of like HEAP or utility bill credits. The total budget for the state, and that includes HEAP and also funding coming out of the utilities, is somewhere around $700 to $800 million a year that goes just to kind of households to help them pay for their energy bills. So when you kind of stack it up statewide, we're probably talking about nearly $1 billion of investments that would go to households every year. Whether that's again clean energy, energy efficiency, or energy assistance. So hopefully that's helpful. But I can do a further dissection of that when we regroup as a team in a few weeks.
So I think that will help us at least put some context around things. But I also think that there's a level of not ambiguity, but from what I hear from all of you is that things are also going to have to change. You would, and this goes to the idea that you want agencies to design and target efforts geographically. And that is a different approach than has been traditionally taken. So some of the information, I think, while useful, will also not reflect what reality will be when you guys create and vote on a definition here. So I do want to bring that up because I want to know from you all how much those data will really affect what decisions you make here now. I think it will make it feel better or worse. I think it will, but would it really change, say, the proportion of DACs that you decide to do? Is it 35? Is it 30? Is it 40? Would that be affected by this information? I don't know whether it would or not. I would ask you to think of that because I think it will be really important for us to really get into the minutia of what we're going to have to decide and vote on soon. Because, I know you guys love meeting with me, but I'm sure you're kind of tired of having 3-hour meetings every now and then. So, any questions, thoughts there?
Alex, this is Chris. I guess while people are waiting to jump in, I'll just say I think the other kind of lens here, and I've kind of been thinking a lot about this, is we are, no matter what we're discussing when it comes to kind of what current budgets look like and how they're distributed, we are dealing with some hypotheticals because we don't have the criteria set yet in terms of what a disadvantaged community, would look like under the law. And, I think there's going to be a need for us to, be able to basically track or geocode, where those dollars are going historically, just to get a sense, how much do things have to change? And so, I'll just kind of throw that out there as well. And while we're talking, I'll pull up, I think we shared this a couple of meetings ago, but I did share kind of where NYSERDA was when it comes to our investments going into the communities that are part of the interim definition. And that might give a little more context to, or at least some additional kind of consideration for what this could look like if it's extrapolated out to like a broader set of communities here. But anyway, just something to think about.
Thanks, Chris. That's helpful context. This is Abby. I'm the one who keeps raising this question, of course, about rural, low-income rural residents and what does our approach mean for them? And as you said, Chris, there's like, a lot of hypotheticals here. And so we don't know till we do it, maybe to some extent. So what I would, I guess, throw out there as a potential approach, kind of building on the potential approaches you have here, Alex, is, if we're going to be evaluating this each year, to feel good about whatever decision we make, I would want to see really good data every year about where's the investment going. And, getting back to something Elizabeth has raised numerous times about this being additive, that this investment would need, again, kind of for my own comfort level, to be above and beyond what already happens. And so the level of investment in those rural communities for low-income residents in rural communities, or just elsewhere in the state, non-designated DACs, if they are all, if they're exclusively geographic. My real thing is I don't want that money to go away, right? The money that's already going to those individuals or those individual households. So if, like, we start with whatever we start with for year one, maybe just a, exclusively geographic definition. But then when we come back together a year from now to assess if it's working, being able to see that geocoded, information about where, who is being able to participate in this transition. If that data demonstrates that, in fact, these households are not getting left behind and that it is additive, to what was already happening, then I would feel good about it. And, or maybe in our final thing, we need to, have some explicit language about, I don't know, a designated percentage or something that is, if we do include a specifically individual household, criteria, having that again kind of be above and beyond what the law requires for this geographic definition. I don't know if that made sense. So I need to clarify. Yeah. Please let me know.
No, that made a lot of sense. And I think it's also something we should talk through as far as options. So we are going to get there today. The other part I want to mention to that is the idea of evaluation and recognition of things that you all can put forth recommendations of what you want to see. We can help guide you with that. I mean, we're evaluators over here and researchers, so we can kind of help suggest different metrics or things you want to be able to see, but I don't see anything saying that what you would like to evaluate and look at X, Y, and Z every, for the first year to see what's going on.
You know what actually would be helpful in following this and tracking this conversation. Part of what I've had, which is one of the reasons I've asked, not just me, several of us have asked, what is the actual current distribution of funding when it comes to all these different buckets? Because in my mind, let's say HEAP, right? Like, it's not, I'm not afraid, or maybe I should be, but I'm not worried that, like, money is going to middle class households, right? Like, I'm assuming a certain amount of foundational competence and good faith that, that HEAP, for example, funding is going to low income households, right? So I've not, the thing that would change in my mind was never, I don't think, that, we're going to be shifting money that's already in an anti-poverty program, say, or program, skewed to people living in poverty, that more money would go because somehow money is leaking out to so to me, that wasn't the issue. The issue was, and maybe this is where we need to be as a working group and as a state, is, this is the sum total of HEAP recipients, and every last one of them is a low-income household, right? Great. Not great, but that is what it is. The question, I think, the bottom line question for us, which is where all of these benefits question ultimately lead, is what is the percentage of low-income people throughout the state that are, in other words, is the HEAP funding enough? Is it reaching every person that's low income in the state of New York that needs that kind of assistance? That to me is the additive part, right? Like I'm not questioning, but that's when it comes to household base benefits. To me, the question of what would change, like I know that when we were working on the law, the change that so many of us envisioned was more communal, was more geographic, was more, yeah, we're pretty certain that, you know, EJ communities are not getting the benefit of the kind of clean energy investments that would reduce climate vulnerabilities, right? We took that as an article of faith, but we needed to see, okay, that's our just, you know, bread and butter assumption. Where are the numbers? What's actually, where are the investments actually being? And look, and this is not casting aspersions on any executive. It's just the nature of the work where, you know, executives want, for a variety of reasons, to see monies distributed geographically, sometimes for political considerations, right? And that's where I think the change, at least Nija and our members were hoping to see, is at the end of this process of the CLCPA implementation, we will see 35 or 40% of investments for offshore wind, for, you know, electrifying buses and bus depots in EJ communities, whatever that mix of stuff is, that infrastructure stuff. Those are the, I think, buckets of funding that are probably the largest amounts of funding that we have in the future, that without the CLCPA, we would have gotten no assurances that they would be targeting the most vulnerable in our state. So that to me is yeah, I'm not expecting that the change will be that, you know, money was going to heap to non-poverty stricken households or households on the poverty level, but that, you know, in fact, are we missing? And that becomes a I think qualitatively different question that we all have to grapple with. So again, let me stop there and apologies.
I think that's a good summary of, you know, that again, the idea to kind of talk or think of the additive approach of geographic elements in addition to the current, you know, status quo. Okay, well, let's continue on because I want to get through. Actually, where are you all feeling? Because we've been going for an hour and 48 minutes. Would you like your 10-minute break now? I think it would be fine if we came back at, it's 11 plus 3.
Yeah, so you can do 2 o'clock, right? Just come back at 2?
Yep, that sounds great.
He is back.
Everyone?
And we can get started again.
Okay, I cannot see anyone on video right now, so I'm not sure if everyone is back or not.
Yeah,
I'm going to assume that you all are. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Abby. Next slide, please, Alana.
Sure.
So I'm going to continue with a bit of the summary, but also kind of talking through and making sure that everyone's on the same page of what we discussed and expressed interest about last time. We talked through the proportion of the state that we should designate as DAGs last time, and everyone leaned more toward the less than 40%. There was a lot of discussion about, you know, the percentage of funding for this and wanting to make sure that, again, that the funding is focusing on areas and having an effect. And to do that, designating less than 40% was kind of what we arrived on. And we really looked at 35% as the kind of sweet spot and looked at some maps to do that. So that's the last recap. What that means is that as we discussed, that there's still some, even at 40%, there's still some low income area residents that are outside of the DACs. That's particularly true in rural areas, but it's a substantial amount. So Amanda's going to go through the next slide.
Alana, can you move us? Okay, great, thank you. So I think we've seen a lot of this information before. It changes a little bit when we change the scenarios, but not much. So what we're finding is, with our 44 to 45 indicators, there's really no way that all low to moderate income households can be covered by a geographic definition alone. We've tested a lot of different things and found that even if we adjust or expand the scores to include absolutely all of the lowest income tracts, for example, the high poverty tracts, we still can't include all low income households. We can't even include all households below the poverty line because they truly are dispersed throughout the state, including in moderate and high income areas. And this effect, as Abby said, is, affects rural areas as well. So what this chart shows is the first line is showing DACs overall about 35%, and this is in a scenario where we're purposely designating 35% of census tracts as DACs. About 35% of households are in DACs. The next line shows that if you think about households with incomes less than 80% of area median income, which is generally considered moderate income for energy assistance programs, about 48% of those households are in DACs, which is good news as we design it, and as you would hope DACs have proportionally more low and moderate income households. And then the last line thing shows that, thinking just about households with incomes below 100% of the federal poverty line using census data, about 57% of those high poverty households reside within the geographic bounds, the census tracts of one of the DACs. So, it's good that proportionally more of these households are in DACs, but that still means that over 441,000 high poverty households are not in DACs, representing about 43% of this household. And this is kind of the analysis that we looked at, that we've shared in the past to kind of show, the bounds of what can be covered in a geographic definition.
Any questions?
So, any questions?
One thing I find quite stark about this is that even though the geographic definition does a really good job of capturing lots of things, just by the reality that people live across the state, not just in poverty and in other places, means that we're still not capturing a lot of the population that live in poverty. And that's partly by design, because the geographic definitions are focused not just on income, but also just the reality that people live all the way across the state, and as Amanda said, in places where you have moderate income and are not designated a DAC, generally because of other reasons. So what this leaves us with is missing people that are potentially very at risk of not being able to respond to a climate crisis at some point. And then it really kind of comes to, what do we want to do about that? Do we want to do anything about it? Do we not? Or do we want to address it with some kind of household definition addition, individual criteria definition? So if you go to the next slide, Alon. You can skip this one because we just kind of talked through that. Individual criteria, they're talking about the people in the household, not the building location. And again, that excludes the geographic part, which is talking about the building location and where they're census tracts that they're in. This is more about the people. The idea here is to then try to add in some elements of those that are living in areas that are not designated DACs into this pot of money. Does anyone have any questions about this? I know we've gone through it, but thoughts here? Okay, I'm going to move right along then to say that what does matter though is how we define low income and what you want to do there. So assuming that you want to at least think about adding an individual household criteria, which I think is still an open question. Some of you are more open to it and want it than others, and I think that we should talk about that. But I also want us to be thinking about the specifics of the definition. If you do include an individual criteria, what that is going to look like. Is it going to look like 60% of state median income, 150% over federal poverty line, 80% less than area median income, or the federal poverty line? Like what is that line that you want to put on there? And that does actually change, how the proportion that are then in the state that would be covered by this. So Amanda's going to go through the next slide, that's what they're called, and talk through what that would mean as far as designation. If you can go back one.
Great. So what we're looking at here is, let's say that there's a geographic DAC definition where 35% of households in the state reside within a geographic disadvantaged community. How many households might be considered or included in the investment accounting if lower income households outside of DACs are also part of that 40% investment accounting? So the table shows different options depending on where you put the income threshold. So if the low income household definition were set at households with incomes below 100% of federal poverty line, that would mean that that would add another 6% of households eligible for kind of targeting and tracking in that way, which would mean that a total of 41% of households in the state would either be in a geographic DAC or be a high poverty household outside of a DAC. Another option is either something like less than 200% of the federal poverty line, or something like 60% of state median income, which is about the same level and also used for a lot of state programs. That would add about 14% of households in addition to the geographic DACs, meaning that about 49% of households in the state would either reside in a DAC or be a low to moderate income household outside of a DAC. And finally, with something, oh no, that's still low income, sorry. So 200% federal poverty line or 60% of state median income is still considered low income for programs like LIHEAP, utility bill assistance, and energy programs. And then expanding things more to a common moderate income threshold, like 80% of AMI adds, as you can imagine, a lot more households and would add about 23% more households, giving about 58% of New York households either in a geographic DAC or a moderate income household outside of it. These are, they seem like very precise numbers, but it is based on, 5-year census estimates. This probably give or take some percentages in households here.
So I want us to kind of stick here and talk through this and see what you guys think. How does this feel? Is this something you're interested in again or not? Knowing what we know about the expenses and wanting to keep that kind of closer to 40% designation, whether it's with geographic plus individual or anything else like that. But how do you feel about this? Do you have any questions? Is this not helping?
This is Abby. I have a question about the numbers themselves. The previous slide, or a couple slides back, when you said that in the 35% scenario over 441,000 households are not, that are in poverty are not in DAX. Which one of these does that align with? Like, which poverty definition was that based on?
That was the first row, which is 100% of federal poverty line, which is an income level of $17,000 to $18,000.
So if we go for that first line, adding the 6%, we are covering all of those 441,000 households?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
This is great. This is Rawa. I just had a clarifying question. So my question is, what if, because we're also addressing changing neighborhoods, if a household is located in a DAC, but really are not income qualifying, will we be able to catch that? Like, meaning, you know, someone who's a high income earner, just because they happen to be situated in a DAC, then don't receive those benefits? Are they excluded from the benefits or not?
Depends on the type of program and funding. If it's a more community-oriented funding source, then I think that they would benefit from it on some level. And it also depends on whether the programs decide to use the geographic criteria as a automatic criteria in, which, by the way, a lot of utilities across the state do already. So if they are in a certain kind of tract or census blocked that is designated as really low income, then they're automatically allowed to benefit from added incentives or what have you. So I don't think there's a clear answer to that, other than I think it really would depend on how things are implemented.
Chris, do you want to weigh in on that from a program perspective of, you know, maybe something like a home performance program or clean energy communities or something? I think you're muted.
Double mute. Sorry, guys. So I was also going to just weigh in with just some data. So we did talk through this at a previous working group meeting, but you know, at NYSERDA we've done some we've been geocoding you know, completed projects for the last couple of years, and you know, have an overlay with the interim set of disadvantaged communities criteria. And for our low and moderate income programs, and this is January of last year through October of this year, roughly 34% of our low and moderate income dollars are falling within the interim disadvantaged communities criteria, which represents about 27% of census tracts. I don't, you know, I think it's good to kind of flag, you know, like, you know, we're still seeing, you know, a number, quite a few, you know, projects that are happening outside of those interim DACs, and until we kind of land kind of the final set of criteria, it's going to be hard to say kind of really what we would be leaving out. But the thing I wanted to point out from an implementation perspective is the LMI programs that are run at NYSERDA and the utilities and you know, some of the other agencies use 80% of the AMI as a cutoff. I think one of the challenges that we'll run into if we are to kind of look at something like federal poverty level, 100% of federal poverty level, from an implementation perspective, that would be difficult for a number of state agencies to implement, just because we have a number of program and policies that are essentially tied to, you know, 60% of the state median income or HEAP eligibility, which is a, you know, federal kind of program, and that was done initially to just create categorical eligibility. So if, you know, a household is eligible for, you know, one of the largest income eligible programs in the state, then they're automatically eligible for these other clean energy initiatives. So just to flag, there are like implementation considerations that we'll have to incorporate as we're kind of thinking about this. And then the other thing, yeah, to the point of like geographic eligibility, and would a household that would be like, you know, of higher income in a disadvantaged community count? I think Alex's point was right. I think it will depend on how the program is structured and designed. So some of the recent experience that we have at NYSERDA anyway, is we have established geographic eligibility for the Empower New York program, which is, you know, targeting households that are at 60% of the state median or lower. So that would kind of correspond with the 200% federal poverty level threshold, basically. And so, but one of the things we did was, you know, really kind of took a strong look at like, what are those criteria for the geographic eligibility? So we didn't say it's the whole, you know, the whole census tract. You know, we looked at kind of, you know, census block groups that were, you know, had a higher proportion of, you know, very low income households in them, just to ensure that we weren't, you know, providing, you know, no cost services to households that would be, you know, of higher income or higher means. So, you know, there are kind of like programmatic design, you know, considerations that the agencies will have to take into effect when it, you know, when thinking about how to deliver on the, you know, the objectives that we have here. So, you know, not to go back to too far back in this conversation, but Abby's point previously about, you know, being able to start somewhere and be able to calibrate from there, I think is really important. You know, we are talking about hypotheticals, and until we can say, you know, with certainty that X% of our low-income energy assistance funds was going into residents of disadvantaged communities, or X% of our, you know, broader clean energy dollars are going into those communities, it's really going to be hard to kind of, you know, at least today, before we get the criteria established, you know, just talk about how agencies are going to calibrate, or how they should calibrate. So I think there has to be, you know, some sort of, you know, thought about, you know, starting somewhere and then, you know, evolving that approach based on, you know, like real world experience. So I'll just kind of say that from like an administration perspective, that would be, you know, the most straightforward way to do it. But, you know, we definitely need to make sure we're hitting our goals here. So I'll stop there for a minute.
So this is Amy. You know, when I was looking at these numbers in the previous slide, you know, in the 400 and some thousand people, you know, my gut reaction was, well, we've got to include them. We've got to include the 100% of federal poverty. But what I heard you say, Chris, and maybe I'm wrong, is that would be very difficult for the state agencies to be able to pull out or to work with. Is that true?
Yeah, so we would have a hard time kind of, you know, setting kind of lower eligibility thresholds than, you know, some of those larger programs like HEAP. So, and, you know, maybe to put a little more context on this, when we're talking about households that is at 200% of the federal poverty level, you know, that's essentially, you know, a household with an annual income of $50,000, you know, for a family of four, you know, $50,000 to $55,000. I don't know where it is today, but, you know, that is a household that, you know, is definitely kind of in need of assistance. And we have 2.3 million of those households in the state. So if we looked at that middle kind of bar, you know, so in terms of the 100%, you know, FPL, I mean, certainly those households are even, you know, in more of need of assistance. But if we were actually to segment the LMI population, and we don't have all the numbers in front of us today, but when you look at kind of where some of these households live, you know, when we're thinking about kind of 100% of FPL or lower, a lot of those households do live in, you know, affordable multifamily, buildings where they may have heat included in their rent, and so there may be other, mitigating factors for those households that some of those other households in this, second income band might not have. I don't want to turn this conversation to like a value judgment of like who needs help more, but just kind of pointing out, these are the things we're potentially weighing when we start to, decide, what is the cutoff for this sort of, this decision.
Yeah, I think you put on the stack. I also saw Elizabeth come off mute, so I want to hold space for her as well.
No, I'm good. Thank you, though.
Just wanted to clarify what what the second line is. That 200% of the federal poverty line is roughly equivalent to 60% of state median income. State median income, 60% of state median income is, as Chris said, what's used for several programs, including LIHEAP and utility bill assistance, and still considered low income. So the second line is still low income, as Chris said, maybe $50,000 for a family of 4. It looks like it's about $42,000 for a family of 2. And so this line is kind of an approximation of 60% of state median income, which would be kind of more implementable than this federal poverty line thing because it's already in use in programs. But this row here, we just used this as an approximation because it was more readily available in census data. But if you were to implement this, since you're qualifying individuals, you could use that 60% of state median income as your guide.
Eddie, did you have a question?
I actually had two. One is along the lines of these mitigating factors. I just want to point out, am I correct in assuming that when we're talking about, 200, let's say we're talking about a household making $50,000 a year, there's no COLA adjustment we're talking about here, right? Like we're talking about the same income category of 50,000, whether you live in a rural area or you live in New York City. If that's the case, we're not talking apples to apples here, because the cost of living is so much higher in New York City that to break even or to reach the same kind of impacted or vulnerable population would mean that the numbers would skew higher in New York City, downstate, forget New York City. So I just want us to be mindful of that, because it's a very real consideration that I don't think we're processing that as a working group. The second thing I was going to ask is it at all possible to take these households, these percentages of households across the state? Is there a way to do an analysis that shows the racial breakup, the racial composition of that? Because I think that if you remember, again, over the summer, part of the problem with environmental racism is that, in fact, it's, when you look at, again, multiple studies have shown that even middle income African-American communities face higher environmental burdens than lower income white communities. So, I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that if we're just talking income, that we're somehow going to be okay. Because again, Black households that are middle income in certain cases still have higher environmental burdens. And so it might be helpful for us to, if it's possible, to get a racial breakdown and composition of these numbers as well.
We can try. I think some of those numbers might be hard to kind of quote unquote crosstab, like cross and look at as far as income and race via census data, but we'll try. If you go to the next slide, Amanda, go.
We can certainly, it's pretty easy if you go back to that slide with the 441,000, we can replicate something like that for race and ethnicity. It's just the intersection might be hard.
Which one was it? How far back?
Let's go back one more.
We might.
Go ahead. keep going.
While you guys are doing
This
that,
one we can replicate.
if you go to the NYSERDA website, we have what we're calling an LMI tool. The data is a little outdated. I think it goes back to the 2015 kind of ACS, but we did kind of break down income, housing type, race and ethnicity, as well as geographic location. So we can kind of speak to Eddie's point with some level of detail, at least. So we could pull that, and share it after the call. And that's, publicly available, that database.
Do that. Alana, if you can move to slide 27. To Eddie's point, keep going, about the federal poverty line as opposed to the area median income, that they use a blanket across the whole state or across the whole country, really, and what that means. Can you keep going? To about, let's see here, keep going. Yeah, there we go, this one. So here you go, you can really see that the cost of living is much higher, and it is accounted for in that area median income. What we can look at is the 60% area median income for New York State and try to do that. One of the things that's just really hard to model within the realities of what we have is, like, we can't pull those data in and then geographically compare them and draw in the data as far as like the percent of 60% area median income plus X plus Y in our tables. So that's why we're using the analogous or similar-ish 100% federal poverty line. That doesn't mean that we can't, in the definition, require it to be 60% area median income, which would then geographically kind of attenuate based on the cost of living in that. So Eddie, that's something to make note of. Just not something that we can model as easily, well, at all. Stop. To the point of race and income and the interaction of that, Eddie, I think it's also really important to note and also look at. I also think that that's what the benefit of having the geographic definition and making sure that that is the main element of this criteria is designed to do, because we significantly made sure that race and income both separately are there to allow them to interact together, so that they can help pull out some of those areas that have middle income Black families living in that geographic area, and to give them more of a chance to be designated a DAC. So I think that that's also a place where we should look at that as well, and to kind of see, because there's some areas that have a higher proportion of Black residents, and they still have a higher income than other areas, and they're still considered a DAC.
Hence the difficulty of this.
It's so hard, right?
I'm trying to be real. Yeah, it's tough, man. Yeah.
This is a giant puzzle, and I like, to Rawa's point about gentrification, that's another thing that if you're starting to look at these different areas, I think, and making sure that we're not including accidentally people who perfectly well have the wherewithal to do these things on their own, and giving them funding that could go better in other places. This is where I think that longitudinal view and testing of this and a really solid evaluation of this has to happen, so that we're coming in and assessing where the damage is, what are those unintended consequences. Then again, I think that you can say that. Abby, you have the floor.
Thanks, Alex. It's a question for Chris, getting back to the thing about programs and kind of what this would actually mean or look like for program implementation. I'm wondering if you could speak just a little more to which programs, specifically like NYSERDA programs, you would see as relevant. And I'm thinking about, you know, what Eddie said about HEAP. HEAP, it's HEAP, and I could be totally wrong about this, but it seems like HEAP is not going to change, right? Like where HEAP money goes, and that's just like not a thing that would change. But it seems like maybe there are some nice sort of programs where eligibility and targeting, and just the amount of funding that is going one place to another, that there's more flexibility around some of those programs. Can you tell me if I'm kind of right or wrong to be thinking about it that way?
So, you know, thinking about NYSERDA programs, the ones that would be really kind of targeted at, you know, household income would be like the Empower New York program, Assisted Home Performance with Energy Star. We have the multifamily performance program, which, you know, we're currently kind of working with the state's investor-owned utilities to, you know, develop a multifamily program to eventually take over for the multifamily program that NYSERDA runs. Then we have a Solar for All, which is like the no cost CDG subscriptions. And then we do have some, you know, new construction initiatives that are targeted at lower moderate income households, or, you know, buildings or homes that would be, you know, purchased by lower moderate income households. So those would be the main the main programs. But the issue would be to what extent we're changing eligibility thresholds, because, you know, then you get into kind of systems changes and, you know, the cost of doing income eligibility verifications. There's been a lot of work done between state agencies to over the last several years to leverage what is known about you know, households receiving public assistance and HEAP to do this, you know, categorical eligibility. So, you know, if they're receiving HEAP, they're automatically eligible. And so kind of separating kind of those two things out will be more administratively, you know, burdensome and costly. So, you know, we could be in a position where we're kind of, you know, asking households to provide more income documentation, you know, which is not something we want to be doing, you know, for both the client or the household and the state entity. But so, you know, there's certainly kind of like practical implications of changing the way we're doing things. But, you know, I think one of the things that, you know, not to go back and harp on it, but, you know, it's really going to be important for us to see where we are, right, with respect to, you know, how these programs, as they're currently designed, you know, kind of playing out to benefit residents, you know, within the communities that we identify here. You know, so I think NYSERDA has more flexibility than most of the other agencies. So we certainly aren't tied to federal, you know, eligibility requirements like HEAP is. But at the same time, you know, any deviation from kind of the, you know, those sorts of established income eligibility thresholds comes at, you know, at the cost of, you know, administrative funds and, you know, just burden for households or participants. So those are the things we'd want to weigh.
Thanks, Chris.
Yep. Hopefully that's helpful.
So,
I mean, sorry, the only thing I was going to say, Alex, is, you know, I think, and I'll just speak for NYSERDA, you know, we want to be in a position where we can start to orient programs to, you know, be more kind of geographically focused. But think about like Empower, right? So, you know, the more we can do kind of geographic eligibility, you know, the better for, you know, residents, you know, the easier it is to ensure that we're kind of delivering kind of a certain level of investments into communities. But, you know, at the same time, we want to make sure that we're not kind of excluding people from participating or providing those services to people who probably don't need it, because we're talking about like a $10,000 work scope, right, for a energy efficiency retrofit for a home. So when you're in a situation where, there are finite resources. So regardless of, how much we say the state, has available and, where those funds are going, there's still kind of at the end of the day, there still are kind of resource allocation decisions that we made. So, kind of looking at like, should we be putting that level of funding into a household that's, that's making kind of higher than, the area median income, or a household that's significantly below it? We always want to kind of, do the latter. So we'll have to continue to kind of weigh kind of the, the way that we're, designing and implementing like geographic eligibility. But the way forward, I think, is to be able to start doing something and kind of, monitor and kind of evaluate it and calibrate it. So, and that's kind of the way we started with Empower with respect to geo eligibility. So hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, so Alana, if you can go to the next page, I think we really have to come down to two big questions. And then there's a lot of sub questions on there, but all of this with the vision of getting to the vote soon rather than later is really trying to understand where we feel we are. And so we've given you the numbers, and I think that we can rework some things to look at it, but off the cuff, I'd like to get a sense check right now of those that are gonna vote, how they feel about individual criteria versus no individual criteria, just off the cuff. And then I also want to get a sense of kind of that, are we going to say 60% median income? This is not a deciding thing. I just want to get senses so that we know where we can go and where we're seeing debate. I know you're all still taking this in, but so the first part is individual definition or criteria over and above a geographical criteria. How are you all feeling about that? And I am going to do the uncomfortable pause thing, and I would like you each to say what you're thinking there.
This is Raul. I can't, for whatever reason, my chat is disabled, which is fine. But I like having both the geographic and individual.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Sonal. I agree with Rawa. I'm open to some individual component. I do feel conflicted about that component exactly, but I think I'm into it just as an overarching thing we'll do.
Cool. Thank you. Abby's good with it. Amy's good with it. Jonathan to date is. Thank you for chatting with those. Anybody else?
Alex, could I trouble you to go back to the slide that actually had those three options broken out?
Yeah, 2 slides over, back. Thank you.
Wasn't there one much earlier? I was talking about that one, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's like 5 or 6 slides back. It's the one that's showing the gap. This one. Is this the one, Eddie?
I think you go to the one you just skipped it. I think there was one with the 3 circles.
Oh, go back
Yeah, sorry.
even more. Yep, 21.
Yo,
that one right there. This is not including an individual one, but this is more about like the proportion that we would designate for the geographic definition.
Gotcha. No, that's right. Yeah, I'm sorry because I move forward one slide. I'm so sorry. The slide that actually broke it down. Yeah.
And this is based on the kind of decision or at least discussion last time of, say, doing a geographic kind of proportion of 35% DAX, then what would that look like as far as those outside of the DAX that were missing? And it's those 441,000 households below the federal poverty line.
So this doesn't cover the middle option of the 60% below state median income or something around there, or 60% below area median income, which would, I don't have the numbers in front of me. for that?
You know, I'd be open if I just I'm stuck on the racial breakdown also. Yeah, sorry, keep going.
No, I think let's go then to slide 26. Next one, I think, sorry. Clearly my deck is a little different from yours. Keep going. It's because I deleted slides. That's pesky. Here you go. So Eddie, I sense some reticence on your part, and I think that some of the things that we can tinker with here is, you know, you could reduce the proportion of the 35%, or we could put other things on there. To Chris's point, starting with one approach with a commitment to review and annual review periods is certainly an option that we can have. And then I think it would be, if you all are interested, at least on some tacit level, to understand or include some kind of individual household criteria in addition to the geographic one. What we can then do is start to really drill into those definitions, because my sense is that you all are leaning toward, and maybe I'm wrong, the 60% of state median income. Or is it the federal, 100% federal property? That's the next question I'm asking, since everyone's kind of okay with an individual criteria.
Can I address or speak to Eddie's point about the kind of race and ethnicity kind of breakdown? I think the other thing we'll have to consider here is how we actually identify, you know, households that are receiving services based on race and ethnicity. So right now, you know, I think there's a mixed bag in terms of what program applications are asking those sorts of demographic questions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always, you know, easy to require that people fill out the demographic questions. You know, I think I can't speak for other agencies, but I know in some cases it could be like against, like, you know, there's some laws against, you know, kind of requiring people to fill out that information. So as we're kind of talking about, like, maybe to take the conversation back like 2 months or 3 months, we talked about like this shift in strategy that has to happen across agencies anyway, which is going to be, you know, better targeting, getting better intel on where their dollars are going. But one of the things we need to make sure we're doing is, you know, trying to get as much as possible kind of those sorts of, you know, demographics questions kind of into applications and answered. So that way we can better track where dollars are going. I mean, there's ways to supplement, you know, kind of that sort of insight gathering, like maybe doing surveys and that sort of thing. But, you know, those aren't foolproof either in terms of their, you know, reliability or kind of level of, you know, precision you can get to. So anyway, just kind of flagging that as something that, you know, I think has to be like an add-on to kind of the direction that we're going here is like, you know, we need to kind of make sure agencies are being able to capture where the dollars are going, not just geographically, but, you know, across demographic variables as well.
Okay, I think going to be a little pushy here, and I think it's time, because what I want to make sure that we're doing is getting the information you need to get to a vote, and also figuring out what we need to focus on as far as that information. So my pushiness is going to be on 3 levels. And Alana, if I can share my screen, I would love to, because then I would like to kind of actually, let's see here, get down to it as far as the things. So if you,
Okay, I just have to stop sharing mine.
awesome, thank you. Okay.
It's not letting me just, oh, there it is. And I'm going to pass you the ball.
Thank you.
It's going to find you.
Alex, this is Abby. Before you just get, into that, I just want to clarify the yep that was in the chat for me was actually in response to something else. So just to, and as you know, I am open certainly to this idea of including an individual definition, but I want to just say that I am also open to not. So I really appreciate everybody else's openness to considering it, but I'm not like so dead set on it that I can't compromise. Just wanted to put that out there.
I appreciate that. I think that that's good to know. Okay, I'm going to share, and now I can't see any of you all, so just, say something to talk. Okay, there are three things that we're having to deal with, and one is, I think, that we have this idea that geographic designation. And what I want to get us to is, do we all feel okay with this 35%? Or is this something that we want to still tinker with or look at? He says it's a good starting point.
Yeah, I think with the caveat that all of this, that will also be iterative in the following year too, correct?
I think it better be.
Okay, then yes.
Yeah. And I think we need to add language to that in the draft scenario that you put forth for voting, is to really say that this needs to be, again, evaluated and looked at and assessed in various ways. Okay. I'm going to do the silliest graphics, but you'll just have to. It's not pretty. It's okay. And then the idea here is that then there's this other component that we would add. And you think of this as individual criteria. Let's see if I spelled things right. Criteria has always been the bane of my spell check. So if we have this individual criteria, then what leads us then to, if we're good with 35, then that's great. And we can still debate that, and I'm happy to. But if we're okay with 35% as a starting point for this year, and then if we're okay with individual criteria on some level, then what we need to get a sense from you is, where do we go? Are you guys interested in that 100% FPL? Or is it the 60% AMI? And I want to get a sense from you all right now. Are you okay, or do you want to exclude the 80% AMI? Is that too much? Is that going too far? Pull this back up so that you can see.
Abby had a question. Abby, did you want to ask it, or did you want me to?
I just to make sure I'm completely understanding, and I think we are, but for clarity of language, by individual criteria, we are only talking about household income level, right? There's no other individual criteria would be.
Individual criteria, and then I'm just going to add their household income. Chris, broken record, you want to say it? Because I can't read it that fast.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, just not to beat the drum on this, anymore, but the 100% FPL is just going to be, super difficult to track and implement. So I'll just say that as an administrator.
And Chris, can you clarify, is 60% of state median income easier to implement than 60% of area median income? So would the second option be 60% of state median income, or could it be state or area?
Yeah, I think 60% of the state median, that's essentially the LIHEAP and the utility assistance thresholds, and the weatherization assistance program kind of aligns with that. So I think that would be the ideal to continue to deal with kind of ensure continuity there from an administrative perspective. This doesn't address Eddie's point about the geographic, disparities and, housing and just like living kind of burden, but, and that's where the area median can help us. But, I think to start with, for this conversation, I'd say 60% of, we can even say state or area,
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to hear from the whole group on some level. Please know that I can't really read the chats as much, but where you all are feeling on this, like harder to implement or not, I think that I want each of you to kind of let me know what you're thinking about these three options. And I'm assuming, I could be wrong, that 80% AMI is off the table.
This is Amy. I would take that off the table, the 60% AMI. My first instinct was absolutely to the 100%. But understanding, what Chris said about the challenges, I think the 60% state is a good criteria.
And just for clarity's sake, the 80% AMI is the one that you would take off the table as opposed to the 60% AMI or state median income?
Whatever the lower one is. Now I'm confused because I had 100% and 200% of poverty line.
Yeah.
So
this one, and we've got the star here, but I'm just gonna.
Yeah, the 80% AMI is what I would take off the table.
Okay. So
hey Alex, while we're thinking, the other thing I'll just say is, say it earlier, but affordable housing, the majority of affordable housing in New York State goes up to 80% of AMI, and in some cases goes a little above that. I think one of the things, I know we don't have a whole lot of time left in the call today, but in advance of the next meeting, I'll pull together, because I think it'll be helpful for this conversation. Maybe we could just like pull together, a breakdown of like, what are those big program areas that, kind of leverage kind of the different income tiers, because I feel like this conversation is a bit, uninformed by like just what the program reality is.
okay. I think that's a good one. I'm getting down to to-dos because we have 7 minutes left. And thank you all for being willing to kind of talk through some of this. So I'm going to take 80% off, so we're just not going to look at it, but we will start looking at and considering these others. Yes, we'll go to the next meeting, Eddie. I think that's actually really important to talk to next, but I also want us to say, I feel like we've kind of solidified the geographic definition as far as 35%. What we then need to focus on is the rest of this other side. And so our next meeting will kind of focus on that with a little bit here, but this is what we're going to be talking about.
Plus, I think that the 80%, because that's the threshold for rental assistance programs. Sorry, you didn't see the chat, but Chris was saying affordable housing, it's 80% AMI.
Yes. So we're putting that back on the table?
Yeah, and Chris, yep.
Okay. So this is where we're going to focus. I would love to hear if there's other things you would like to talk about and discuss. In the last 5 minutes, I'm going to get to, where's that scheduled next things. And Alana, I'm going to hand it to you. If you want to share your screen, that's fine. I don't have to do this part.
Sure, I'll try to take the ball back from you.
Stop sharing.
Did I take it?
How do I hand you the ball?
I think you have to do it. Yep, you have to grab it. So grab the little arrow next to your name that says presenter.
Okay.
Yep, and drag it up to me. Yeah, it's a little upwards arrow.
Okay.
Thanks.
Grab the upwards arrow.
Why, thank you. Okay, let's share my screen again. And we will skip ahead. Oh, wow, I'm gonna skip ahead a bit, sorry. Okay, so, sorry, this is where we were, and we're going to discuss what the timeline basically is. So even though we missed our last meeting and this was sort of meant to be the voting meeting, we're really not that far off track from where we want to be. I will be sending around a poll that's going to include dates from the 30th of November through the 17th of December. The goal will be to have, I'm going to pick 2 meetings within that time. One will be the next meeting that we kind of go through, and then the last meeting, the furthest one out, will be the voting meeting. So if everyone could, we definitely need to, I really want there to be, and we need to have, and I know it's hard, but 100% participation when it comes to the vote. We need everybody to be there. So if I've identified some times, if there are times that don't work, or if you think that there is another time that I should add in, it seems that afternoons work better for everyone. If you think morning would be easier to get something across, or right now I have them for 2 hours, or you think 3 hours would be better to capture more people, please send me an email and let me know. But the goal is to have a second meeting between November 30th and that second week of December, and to vote, like I said, before the 17th. So I would like us to come to a vote in that week of December 13th. So we're looking to have our next meeting either the 30th of November through the 10th. Does anybody have any questions?
Alana, this is Amy. I would just ask that if we could try to open and close that poll, and I know, you know, I'm as much to blame as anybody else, but as quickly as possible,
Okay.
so that the dates that we're saying were available don't escape our calendars.
I will do that.
Thank you.
So I'll try. So the goal will be we're at the 17th now. I will close that poll on the 24th. Does that sound reasonable to everybody? Does everyone think that they can get in their selections by the 24th?
Alana, if possible, I'm wondering if we might all be able to commit to filling it out faster than that, because again, like calendars just fill up. Could we all do it by the end of the week? I know that's a big ask maybe, but just get it on the calendars.
Is that reasonable for everyone?
Yes, by Friday.
Yeah.
Can I ask just 2 quick questions? Can you guys hear me? I put away the earphone, sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
Does just trying to remember what open meetings law, COVID, all the rest of it, do we have to be, we can still do the vote remotely, correct?
Yes, we can.
Gotcha. My only concern is I know that that second week, that the week of December 13th is going to be, there's a lot going on that week, or there's a lot that's being planned for that week in terms of just EJ work. But that's one of the, is that the last meeting week that we would have in the poll?
That would be before we're getting into that week of Christmas.
Right, like that's where the poll would call.
Yeah.
That's where, okay.
Right. And I don't think anybody, I mean, I don't know what folks' schedules look like the 20th that week. I don't want to put anything there in case people will be leaving town or, you know, putting that kind of pressure. So it really, if you guys agree that we could potentially schedule the meeting during that week, I will do it. I do not celebrate Christmas, so I am fine with it.
No, I didn't mean to suggest that. It's just that I know that there are going to be press conferences and stuff that week on the 13th. So it's, it's going to be challenging. All right.
I was gonna say, I know. Yeah, I was gonna say, if we're willing to push it out, I just didn't want to interfere with anybody's holiday plans. So if people are fine with pushing it out, we could push it out that far. Otherwise, I think we're looking into having the vote in January, and I don't think anybody wants to wait until January.
Agreed.
So did we want to push it out to the 22nd?
No, I wasn't suggesting.
No?
I guess
Okay.
I think what I was suggesting is it would be great if we could have that vote the week of the 6th, but I just don't know how likely that is. That would mean we would have to have the previous meeting the week of the 29th, which is the week after Thanksgiving, which
Right.
I would try to make work. I just don't know, about everybody else's schedule. Yeah.
Well, if everyone could try to get their meeting dates in, like I said, by the end of the week, and that it might work out that way. Like I said, I know back-to-back meetings are not ideal, but it might be what we need to do in this particular instance.
Thank you.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions, concerns, comments before we close things today?
Say one thing, if you all have questions, concerns, comments, please email or call Amanda and me if there's any kind of technical things or numbers that you need. We can start working with Chris to round some of those other parts up, but I think we've got a way forward. If there is anything that you need before the vote, please let us know as soon as possible, then we can get it.
Okay. Well, if no one has anything else, thank you everyone for jumping on these calls. I know that this is, it feels like things get pushed out further, but I think we are making really good progress. As Alex said, if you have any questions, concerns, please feel free to call Illume, Chris, myself, please give us a call. That's why we're here. And please try to complete the poll by the end of the week so we can get those dates and get them on the calendar so everybody can make plans.
Thank you all.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Okay,
We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.